The morning I decided not to set his boat on fire, the tide was coming in hard enough to knock a grown man sideways, and every soul on that dock was waiting to see what kind of man I was going to be. I was 19 that spring, raw-boned and sunburned, with hands already chewed up like an old deckhand's from hauling nets before I'd ever learned to shave proper. Our town crouched low along the gulf like it was bracing against a punch, white clapboard houses leaning into the wind, tin roofs rattling in afternoon squalls, shrimp boats rocking shoulder to shoulder at the pier as if they were whispering secrets to each other. The air always tasted of salt and diesel and whatever the tide had dragged in overnight. My brother Ray stood 3 years older and a foot steadier than me. He had our daddy's shoulders and our mama's quiet way of watching before speaking. That season had started strong. The brown shrimp were running thick, and at dawn the boats coughed awake one by one, engines rumbling like old hounds clearing their throats. Gulls circled overhead, screaming their complaints as we shoveled ice into the hold. The radio weather report crackled through the open cabin door, southerly winds, moderate seas, and we'd ease out past the jetties into water that turned from murky green to a deep, patient blue. There's a rhythm to shrimping that gets into your bones. Pay out the nets. Watch the lines. Feel the drag. Haul and sort in ice. Rope burns biting into sun-cracked hands. Salt drying stiff on denim until your jeans could stand up on their own. By mid-morning the deck would be alive with snapping shrimp and the metallic clink of sorting trays, and Ray would hum some half-remembered tune from the jukebox at Lila's Cafe. That spring mattered more than most. Mama was behind on the house again. After Daddy died of that coughing sickness that took half the men who worked too many years around damp engines and damp air, she kept the books in a stained ledger at the kitchen table, pencil tucked behind her ear. I'd see her late at night, hurricane lantern glowing soft against the thick dark, lips moving as she counted and recounted figures that never seemed to behave. The bank man had started coming by on Saturdays in a pressed shirt that didn't belong on our street. We weren't looking for riches. Just enough to keep the roof and maybe fix the back steps where the wood had gone soft. The man who cut our nets had eaten at our table. His name was Earl Bennett. He'd known Daddy since they were boys diving off the same pier, and he used to ruffle my hair when I was small enough to fit under his arm. He ran a boat 2 slips down from ours, a stout trawler with blue trim that his wife kept painted fresh every spring. Earl had a laugh that carried over the water and a habit of slapping a man's back hard enough to stagger him. Folks said he'd give you the shirt off his back if you asked. It was the 3rd week of the run when we pulled up nothing but shredded line and a stretch of net that looked like it had been through a war. Ray knew before I did. He held up the frayed edge, fingers tracing the clean slice where a knife had done its work. Not torn on rocks. Not chewed by propeller. Cut. Deliberate and neat. The Gulf was calm that morning, too calm for the way my chest started hammering. I could hear my own breath over the engine. We hauled the rest in, and each section told the same story, clean cuts, spaced careful, done by someone who understood exactly how to cripple a boat without leaving much fuss behind. We limped back to dock light as a funeral procession. Word moves faster than tidewater in a fishing town. By the time we tied off, men were leaning against pilings, boots planted wide on slick planks. Someone spat into the water. Someone else muttered, "That's a shame." But they weren't looking at the nets. They were looking at us. Peak season, too, old Marvin said, shaking his head. Week's worth, gone. Earl's boat was tied up 2 slips down, paint gleaming innocent in the sun. Ray didn't say his name. Neither did I. But we both saw the same thing, a smear of our net twine caught in the notch of Earl's starboard cleat, a color just different enough to recognize. By noon the story had settled like silt. Earl had been seen circling near our lines the day before. Fuel was expensive. Shrimp were running tight. Men did foolish things when they felt their own ledger closing in on them. When we got home, Mama was standing at the stove frying mullet, window open to let the salt breeze push back the grease. Ray laid the cut net on the kitchen table without a word. The ledger sat open beside it, numbers marching in crooked columns. She didn't cry. That was the worst of it. She just pressed her lips together and ran her thumb along the edge of that sliced twine like she was checking the hem of a torn dress. "How much?" she asked. Ray told her. She nodded once. Then she said, "You boys eat." That night the dock took on a different sound. Diesel engines were quiet, but talk wasn't. Hurricane lanterns glowed along the pier, and the men gathered in knots, voices low and sharp. Boats had been burned for less. Nets slashed in return. A man's reputation dragged through every bait shop from here to Galveston. "Can't let that stand," someone said as I walked past. "You're Bennett's friend or you ain't," another muttered. I wasn't sure what I was anymore. Ray and I sat on our stern, feet dangling over black water that slapped soft against the hull. The moon turned the surface into broken glass. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" I asked. He didn't look at me. "Everybody's thinking it." Earl's boat was dark. No lantern. No sign of him. "I could do it," I said. My voice sounded older than I felt. "Slip down there after midnight. A little kerosene. Quick strike. Nobody'd say a word." Ray finally looked at me then, eyes catching the moonlight. "And then what?" "Then he knows. And then he comes for us again. Or his cousins do. Or we spend the next 10 years watching our backs every time we push off." Anger sat in me like a swallowed hook. I pictured Mama at that table, pencil worn to a stub. I pictured Earl's big hand clapping my shoulder when I was 10 years old, telling me I'd make a fine waterman one day. "They're expecting it," I said. "Whole town's waiting to see if we got any spine." Ray's jaw tightened. "Spine ain't the same as fire." He stood and went below deck, leaving me with the tide and the dark. I don't remember deciding so much as realizing I'd already decided. Sometime between the lanterns guttering out and the first hint of gray along the horizon, I understood that if I walked down that pier with a can in my hand, something in me would harden permanent. Maybe that's what men called respect. Maybe that's what they called justice. But it would be a kind that kept asking to be fed. Just before dawn, when the boats began to cough awake and gulls started their crying, I saw Earl walking alone toward his slip, shoulders hunched, cap pulled low. He stopped when he saw me sitting there. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The whole dock felt like it was holding its breath. And then I stood up. I stepped off our stern and onto the dock, the wood slick under my boots, and walked toward him without a single man between us to soften what might come. He looked smaller in that gray light, like the night had wrung him out. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from drink or lack of sleep I couldn't tell. The gulls were louder than usual, or maybe it just felt that way. Diesel smoke drifted low, hanging in the damp air. Somewhere behind me, I could sense men pretending to busy themselves with lines and ice chests while angling their heads just enough to watch. Earl stopped a few feet from me. The tide knocked his hull against the pilings with a hollow, steady thud. "You boys had bad luck," he said, not meeting my eyes. I let the silence stretch. I'd always been quick with words, too quick sometimes, but that morning they felt heavy and expensive. "We'll fix the nets," I said finally. That got his attention. He glanced up, confused. Maybe he'd expected shouting. Maybe he'd braced for fists. "That's so," he muttered. "That's so." He swallowed. His throat worked like he was chewing something tough. The wind shifted and carried the smell of bait and brine between us. "You ain't gonna." He let the question trail off, unfinished but understood. I looked past him at his boat. Fresh paint. Clean lines. The blue trim bright against the dull morning. I imagined flames licking up that hull, smoke twisting into the sky, men nodding in approval while pretending regret. I imagined Mama's ledger still open on the table, numbers unchanged. No, I said. The word felt like stepping off a ledge without knowing how far the drop might be. He stared at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. Around us, the dock shifted. A rope dropped. A boot scraped. News travels by air and water both, I could feel it spreading. You should, he said, almost whispering. If I was you, I would. I believed him. That was the strangest part. Maybe, I answered. But I ain't you. There wasn't any grand speech. No righteous thunder. Just that small exchange, swallowed by the hum of engines coming to life. I turned my back on him first. That's what people remember, if they remember anything at all, that I turned away. I walked back to our boat, climbed aboard, and started coiling what was left of our line. Ray studied my face like he was reading weather. Well, he asked. We're going out, I said. With what nets? With what we got. It wasn't bravery. It felt closer to stubbornness. We patched what we could that afternoon, fingers moving through twine by habit, tying knots tight enough to hold but not pretty. The sun climbed and burned the backs of our necks. Tar from the repair bucket stuck under my nails. By evening, our hands were bleeding in fresh places over old scars. Men stopped by in 2s and 3s. You let him off? Marvin asked, not bothering to lower his voice. Nothing to let, Ray said evenly. That's weakness, another man declared. Word'll get around. Maybe it will, I answered. It did. For a while, we were the subject of low laughter at Lila's cafe. I'd walk in and feel the conversation dip like a boat hitting a trough. Some called us fools. Some called us cowards. A few said we were thinking long, which was their way of admitting they didn't quite understand but weren't ready to mock. Earl kept to himself. He avoided our eyes. His boat went out less often that season. When it did, it came back lighter than before. We worked harder than we ever had. Pushed farther offshore. Stayed out longer. I can still hear the radio weather reports crackling through the cabin, storm warnings we weighed against empty holds. The Gulf doesn't reward pride, it rewards persistence. Little by little, the ice chests filled again. Not like before. Not easy. But steady. One evening about a month later, a squall rolled in faster than predicted. The sky went the color of old bruises, and the wind snapped the flags along the pier straight as boards. Ray and I had just tied up when we saw Earl's boat fighting the chop past the jetties, nets half-hauled, deck a mess of tangled line. Engines coughing, Ray observed. It was. Even over the rising wind, I could hear it stutter. Men gathered again, hands on hips, watching. Let him figure it, someone muttered near me. Fair's fair. The storm hit with the suddenness only Gulf storms know. Rain came sideways. The pier turned slick as soap. Earl's boat yawed hard, nearly clipping the rocks. I don't remember deciding. My body moved before my mind caught up. Ray was beside me, already shoving off. You sure? He asked, but he was smiling in that tight way that meant he already knew. We powered out into the chop, hull slamming hard enough to rattle teeth. Spray soaked us through in seconds. I grabbed a line and braced as we came alongside Earl's crippled boat. His face when he saw us, well, I've carried that look longer than I've carried most things. It wasn't gratitude, not yet. It was disbelief. We tossed him a towline. He fumbled once, then caught it. The rain flattened everything, the sea, the sky, the men watching from shore reduced to smudges. Hold steady. Ray shouted over the wind. We hauled him in slow, careful, inch by inch, both engines straining. My arms burned. My eyes stung with salt and rain. For a moment, as lightning forked somewhere inland, I wondered if this was foolishness after all. If mercy had a habit of drowning the man who offered it. But we made the harbor. Tied him off. Cut his engine. The storm blew through as fast as it had come, leaving the docks shining and the air scrubbed clean. Water dripped from the brim of Earl's cap. He climbed onto the pier like an old man, legs unsteady. He stood there a long time before speaking. "I cut, he said finally, voice hoarse. Nobody answered. "I thought if I slowed you down, I could catch up." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Didn't think it'd go that far." There it was. No excuses. No denial. Just a tired confession hanging in damp air. I felt every eye on me again. The town waiting for its next lesson. "You done what you done," I said. He nodded once. "That don't mean we gotta keep doing it." The word surprised me as much as anyone. Something shifted after that. Not all at once. Towns like ours don't turn on a dime. But men started looking at us different. Not soft. Not weak. Just steady. When disputes flared, and they always do, over lines or fuel or whose boy dented whose truck, people began to ask what Ray thought. Sometimes they even asked me. Earl paid us back in small, practical ways. A spare part when ours cracked. An extra pair of hands during a heavy haul. He never made a show of it. Neither did we. The ledger at Mama's table evened out that year, not with a miracle, but with enough. I left the Gulf for a spell in my 20s, chased work upstate where the pay came in envelopes instead of weather reports. But I carried that spring with me like a compass I didn't know I'd been handed. In factories and later in offices, when a man slighted me or cut a corner that cost me, I felt that old hook of anger set in my chest. And I'd remember the dock at dawn. The clean slice of net. The way the whole town leaned forward, waiting for fire. Sometimes I answered loud. I won't pretend I became a saint. But more often than not, I chose quiet. Chose the longer road. Not because I was afraid. Because I'd learned what happens when you feed the other thing. Now I sit on this same dock some evenings, boards replaced but the tide unchanged. My hands are knotted with arthritis instead of rope burns. The boats are bigger. The radio's clearer. But diesel still coughs at dawn, and gulls still cry like they've got grievances older than any of us. People talk about strength like it's something you swing. Like it's measured in how hard you can hit back. And there's truth in that, sometimes. The world can be mean, and a man ought to know how to stand his ground. But I learned, that spring of cut nets and heavy looks, that there's another kind of strength that doesn't make much noise. It doesn't light up the night sky. It doesn't earn quick applause. It just keeps you from becoming the very thing you're fighting. When the tide comes in hard these days, knocking at the pilings like it did that morning, I think about that 19-year-old boy with salt in his hair and kerosene in his thoughts. I'm proud of him, though he didn't feel brave at the time. He felt small and uncertain and a little foolish. But he stepped back from the match. And sometimes, that's the hardest step a man will ever take.